When his book first came out, there was such a huge reaction to it, back in '04, I think it was, or something like that. There was such a huge reaction to his book, but it is well worth your while to listen to some of his talks, if that interests you. And remember, also part of this rehab is the visualization. So I'm not only giving my brain instructions to move this hand, I'm also visualizing this hand actually moving. You will have heard of sports psychologists who tell people like Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, I remember, you know, that big American basketball player. He came out and said at some point, a lot of my exercise or training I do in my head. I visualize, what's that called? Dunking the ball in the basket, and apparently, again, evidence-based studies, that practices his muscles and agility and ability as much as the actual physical running, dribbling. You see? So there we already know that visualization is also key to neuroplasticity. And I might add, a lot of us are not good at visualizing. I include myself in that. So if I close my eyes and I now try to visualize myself dunking a ball into a basketball basket, I will probably spend more time thinking it than visualizing it. Instead of seeing the pictures, I'll think of the words. It's as good as. Okay? So another example, this is more close to home. This isn't a great physical issue. Michael Merzenich, who is another neuroscientist frequently mentioned in the neuroscientific literature, and I believe quite friendly with the Norman Doidge of the first book, has said, you know, you cannot have plasticity in isolation. And this is what I was saying earlier. So if we change bits in this part of our brain, in the prefrontal cortex, other parts of the brain will also be affected. And so he gives an example of, related to sexuality, of what is not hardwired. So you may have read in the past, perhaps 2 decades, since the advent of the internet and all the things we can see on the internet, should we so desire, that there has been a great deal of men addicted to porn. And a lot of people, psychologists and therapists and addiction counselors and so, seem to believe that once this addiction is there, it's hardwired into the brain. You can't get rid of it anymore. And as you can imagine, these addictions create havoc in couples because, for understandable reasons, even though it's not good how he got there, the man is no longer interested in his wife in that way because it is so much easier, right? To look at somebody or pay for somebody on a screen to do whatever it is you want to do. There's no emotions involved. There's no hassle involved. Honey, you didn't do the dishes. You didn't take out the garbage. Why don't you bring me flowers? Etc., etc. Not to mention the young guys who haven't got anybody in their life yet. How are they ever going to relate to a human woman or girl if what they're seeing on this is so? So anyway, so like I say, a lot of these counselors are saying it's hardwired into the brain, very hard to change. And yet, according to Merzenich, our human libido is not hardwired, and this has been demonstrated. And essentially, one of the best ways, which is a neuroscientific way dependent on neuroplasticity, to help somebody get rid of such an addiction is to get them to be present with A, the triggers, and B, the choice to improve his life by not giving in to the triggers by use of shutting down the internet. Now, that sounds almost impossible for some people, but if I have a child in my house and I don't want that child to see anything violent on my internet, for example, I can put in childproof whatever, so if they're browsing, they'll never get to those sites. Well, in the same way, I can shut down sections of the internet for myself. if I have to do something like that. Anyway, my point of telling you this is the business that even our sexuality is affected by neuroplasticity. Not to mention much more normal examples, like, for example, let's say a young woman has numerous affairs prior to getting married. With each affair, she learns perhaps slightly different sexual techniques because each man is different. Then she marries and then maybe goes to one specific technique because that's what she and the husband enjoy. So in this whole time, the brain, the part of the brain related to sexuality has been changing with each man and then with the husband and then in the remaining of this one thing. So all I'm saying here is it's not that you have to remain any specific way, but that you recognize your sexuality is also affected by neuroplasticity. Emotions, even if it surprises you, are also affected by neuroplasticity. Let me give you an example. Think of a young man, or better said, you probably know that if your parents were cool, maybe a little bit rejecting, or simply they weren't terribly affectionate, but they may have loved you a great deal. You know, it's not a question that they didn't love you. It's just they were kind of like that. German parents, especially German parents of the generation of my parents, had a really bad rap for being like that. In England, you have the stiff upper lip business that Meghan is objecting to, as we know. But you know, a lot of adults, doesn't matter what country they're from, had parents who simply weren't perhaps as outwardly loving and affectionate and come here darling type of thing as we may have liked. Now you may know about something called attachment theory in psychology, which I'm not going to really get into, but it speaks about the bond that forms between the baby and the primary caretaker, which is typically the mother. But you know, it could be a grandmother, could be an auntie, could be a nurse in an orphanage. But this primary caretaker bonding is extremely important in the first 2 years of life, neurologically. That affects the emotions, because the child has taken in information and has processed it, not cognitively, obviously, not with executive function, but the child has processed it in some fashion, and this then affects the adult relationships. And if you do not figure this one out, you know, the adult relationships may be that you typically find yourself with partners who are slightly cool, slightly rejecting, never quite affectionate enough, even though they love you. And you think, oh, you know, why do I pick these awful people? But let's imagine for a minute a man who goes through this sort of scenario that I've just described, and he had this situation with his mother, desperately tried to get her to love him the way he really wanted her to love him, but it didn't happen. So his adult relationships with women are, as I just mentioned a moment ago. He either repeats the maternal pattern, in other words, he picks women who are slightly cold and rejecting, or cool, they don't have to be cold, but he's attracted to them, okay? And the reason he's attracted to him is because of this neurological bit that is already there that is affecting his emotions. And which, you know, is essentially psychology, but we have a basis of understanding psychology neurologically in this regard. Or he'll avoid committing altogether. He'll have one-night stands, or, you know, he'll see women for a week and then he'll tell them he's too busy or he's not at a right point in his life to make a commitment, and off he goes to find somebody else where he doesn't have to make a commitment. Or he'll become a bit of a Don Juan, in the sense that he'll always have 3 or 4 apples in the same basket, because that way he doesn't have to commit to anybody, because that way he's never going to get hurt. So, you know, okay. So this relationship pattern is something we've probably all seen with our friends, somebody we know, whatever, and we recognize. Now, if and when this man that I've just been discussing recognizes this to be a pattern that that he is living, he may now, he might go to therapy, he might come and see somebody like me, or he might read a book that falls off the bookshelf in the bookstore or out of his Kindle. But we run into books sometimes in very serendipitous ways, and he may just work it out himself. Because if he realizes it's a pattern, he also realizes it's not about the women, it's about him, right? If I'm constantly marrying alcoholics, guess what? It's not that I have bad luck. It's that there is something in me that attracts me to alcoholics for whatever codependency reasons from my childhood, and I've got to work that out in me as opposed to saying, oh, these men are, destroying my life. So the recognition of the self in this situation of the man I'm describing, if he persists in recognizing this is on him, not in the sense of fault, but it is his to change, and he begins to change his self-talk. For example, let's say he's going out with a new lady and they are sitting across the dinner table. Maybe it's their third date. He's got his hand on the table, he's been playing with, his glass of wine, and suddenly her hand is on his hand. Now that makes him very uncomfortable. And he's now thinking, oh my God, she's just like all the others. So what does he do? He snatches his hand away, he excuses himself to go to the bathroom or whatever. He might have done this up to now, and he doesn't ask her out again. But if he is now self-aware enough to recognize these patterns in this little thing, this is just a tiny little thing, his self-talk will change. And he is going to say to himself, okay, wait a minute. This is not on her, this is on me. This is my thing to solve. Her putting her hand on me is not something bad about her or something I don't like about her. It is my reaction to it that I need to examine. And he's going to have this kind of self-talk, assuming he's learned enough about himself by now, right? This isn't going to come out of the blue. So he either came to see somebody like me or he read some good books. And as he goes on with this self-talk, convincing himself that this is not on the other people who are making him feel uncomfortable throughout his life, but on himself, and that he needs to change elements within himself, which lead us into self-love, which is a whole other topic, then of course his brain begins to change. And one fine day he may be out with another lady and she may do exactly that same thing, and he will notice, oh, that no longer bothers me. And furthermore, even if it means that she now wants something of me that I don't want to give her, I'll be okay with telling her, no, that's not for me. Do you see? So there are so many things that can change neurologically that then affect our heart, the way we are able to respond in relationships. Okay, now let's go to a whole other kind of example. This is a woman called Barbara Arrowsmith Young. She wrote a book that talks about her own life, and it got a foreword from Norman Doidge, and she's also got a TED Talk out there and other talks that are available. And in her case, she was born with a portion of her brain simply not working. And so I think in her TED Talk, she says this was, I don't know if she was born in 52 or it was in 52 when the doctors were telling her, or her mother, you can just forget about it, this girl will never have a normal life, she will never be able to learn properly, and so on and so forth. And she describes in the book and in the TED Talk how much shame this made her feel about herself. But she also knew there was something deeply, as she put it, wrong with her. She couldn't tell time when they taught her, clocks, the old-fashioned clocks with two hands, because she couldn't figure out the relationship between the two hands. It made no sense to her. She describes that she lived in a very dense fog. Nothing was ever clear. She understood that this woman is her aunt, but she could not understand that this woman who is her aunt is also her mother's sister. It didn't get into her head. And of course, this is merely the beginning. At any rate, she did what she could. There's a very interesting story about it all in the book.